Apple helped build California's image. But more and more, its next big moves are happening somewhere else. Not the new server facility, not some of the manufacturing expansion, not even all of the AI-related growth. And that matters more than it seems, because this is not just a story about Apple. It is a story about what happens when a state keeps the legend, but starts losing the future. Apple recently committed around $600 billion to expand across the United States over the next 4 years. That includes new jobs, new facilities, new supply chain partnerships, a bigger domestic footprint. On paper, that sounds like great news. And for America as a whole, it is. But once you look closer, the real question is not whether Apple is growing. It is where that growth is going. And more importantly, where it is not. What's because Apple is not just another company in California. It is one of the companies. One of the symbols. One of the anchors. Its headquarters are there. Its history is there. Its identity is tied to the state. For decades, California did not just host Apple. It benefited from everything around Apple. The jobs, the tax base, the local business activity, the entire ecosystem built around a company that became one of the most powerful in the world. That is what makes this bigger than a normal expansion story. When a company like Apple starts placing major future capacity somewhere else, it sends a signal. Not always loudly, but clearly. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable. Apple is still deeply rooted in California. That part is true. But some of its most important new investments are landing in places like Texas, not California. That does not mean Apple is leaving tomorrow. That is not the point. The point is that future growth has value. Sometimes even more than current presence. A company can keep its headquarters in one place while building its next chapter somewhere else. And that is the part people tend to miss. One of the clearest examples is Houston. Apple announced plans for a major new facility there tied to the servers behind its artificial intelligence systems. That is not some side project. That is infrastructure connected to one of the most important races in tech right now, AI. That means this is not just another building. It is part of where the company sees its next wave of growth. And Houston is not the only clue. And Apple has also expanded manufacturing and supply chain relationships in other states. Washington, Arizona, New York, Texas. So the pattern starts to look harder to ignore. Apple is investing heavily in America. But a lot of the new physical build-out is happening outside California. That is the key distinction. And this is where the story stops being symbolic. Because growth is not just about bragging rights. It is about who gets the jobs, who gets the contracts, who gets the tax revenue, who gets the spillover, who gets the next decade. That is what is really being decided here. And there is another layer to this. It is not only about buildings, it is also about where teams are being pulled. In 2024, Apple shut down a San Diego division and told employees the team would move to Austin. When this was part of a Siri-related operation, work connected to data and AI systems, employees had a choice: move to Texas or eventually leave the job. Some took the relocation offer. Others did not. Many reportedly chose not to move. So, what happened? Austin grew stronger. California got a little thinner. And that may sound minor. One team, one office, one relocation decision. But this is the part most people miss. Big economic shifts rarely begin with one giant exit. They happen piece by piece, team by team, site by site, supplier by supplier. That is how a state slowly loses its grip on future momentum. Quietly at first, then all at once. And Apple already had a foundation in Texas. This was not a random detour. The company has been building in Austin for years. It announced a major campus there back in 2018. Engineering, research, operations, support. That gave Apple something important, a real operating hub. And once a place becomes a real hub, more decisions start flowing there. That is how corporate geography changes. The infrastructure is already there. The people are already there. The systems are already there. So the next move becomes easier. Then the next one. Then the next one after that. Before long, what used to feel secondary starts looking central. That seems to be part of what is happening now, not a dramatic California collapse, not a huge Apple divorce, something slower, something more realistic, a shift in where the future gets built. And for California, that may be the bigger problem, because states do not only compete for the companies they already have, they compete for what those companies do next. The next factory, the next lab, the next supplier deal, the next technical team, the next round of hiring, the next $1 billion of physical investment. That is the real competition now. And once you frame it that way, this story looks very different. It is no longer just Apple is expanding. It becomes California may not be the default destination anymore. That is a much more serious message. Because prestige only carries you so far. History only carries you so far. A great reputation helps, but it does not automatically win the next project. Companies make those decisions based on cost, speed, logistics, energy, land, permitting, taxes, workforce access, long-term operating pressure. And if another state looks easier, faster, and cheaper, that state usually has the advantage. That seems to be the deeper signal here. Not that California has no strengths. It clearly does. But its old advantages may not be enough to guarantee the next wave of investment. And Apple's recent moves make that harder to deny. There is also a national backdrop here. Trade pressure changed the calculation for many big companies. Supply chains became more fragile. Global manufacturing looked riskier. Dependence on overseas production became a bigger political and business issue. That pushed companies to rethink where they build, where they source, where they place critical infrastructure. Apple is part of that larger shift. That helps explain why it is expanding more inside the United States. But it does not explain why California is not winning more of that expansion. That is the harder question. But because if a company born in California is rethinking where its next capacity should live and keeps landing major pieces elsewhere, then something important is being revealed. California still matters to Apple's story, but maybe not in the same way it once did. That may sound abstract. It is not. This has real-world consequences. When a major facility goes to Houston instead of California, the loss is not just emotional, it is practical. That project creates construction work, maintenance work, security contracts, food service demand, transport demand, local spending, tax revenue. Then come the secondary effects: nearby housing demand, more supplier activity, more small business traffic, more incentive for related firms to cluster nearby. That is how one decision spreads. But the same thing happens with high-value teams. When a division moves to Austin, the impact is not limited to the employees. It reaches landlords, coffee shops, restaurants, local service businesses, city tax streams, the small daily spending that keeps local areas alive. And that is why these moves matter even when they do not look dramatic. Nobody sounds the alarm over one team relocation. Nobody panics over one supplier decision. Nobody treats one new factory in another state like a crisis. But when the same direction keeps repeating, it stops looking random. It starts looking structural. And that is where this becomes an economic realities story. Because this is not only about Apple. It is about how modern America is being reorganized, which states are attracting the next layer of investment, which places are keeping legacy power but losing forward momentum, which regions are becoming the new magnets for expansion, and which ones are slowly learning that reputation does not guarantee growth. Texas has been one of the clearest examples of this. It has spent years making itself attractive to companies looking for room to expand. Cheaper land, different tax structure, a more business-friendly image, faster development pathways. That does not mean Texas is perfect. It is not. It has its own pressures, its own rising costs, its own infrastructure strain. But from a corporate expansion standpoint, the pitch has clearly been working. Apple is one example. Not the only one, just one of the biggest. And that is why California should care. Not because Apple is gone, it is not. But because a company does not need to leave completely for a state to lose something important. It only has to send enough of the future somewhere else. Enough high-value growth, enough infrastructure, enough teams, enough supplier work, enough investment gravity. That is how the center of things changes. Not with one giant exit, with a slow redrawing of the map. That is the part people usually notice too late. The old symbols remain, the headquarters remain, the image remains. So people assume the future still remains too. But that may be the wrong assumption, because the real story is not where Apple came from. Everyone knows that. The real story is where Apple increasingly seems comfortable building what comes next. That is what matters now. Not the anniversary tributes, not the nostalgia, not the branding. The actual map, the actual facilities, the actual hiring patterns, the actual flow of capital. That is where the truth shows up. And right now, the truth looks uncomfortable for California. Apple still belongs to California's past. But more and more, the fight is over who gets its future. And California no longer looks like the automatic answer.